Last week, the Washington Post published a story fact-checking Senator Tim Scott's recounting of his grandfather's life. Scott says that his grandfather dropped out of third grade in order to pick cotton. The Post wrote, quote, Scott's grandfather's father was also a substantial landowner, and Scott's grandfather, artist Ware, worked on that farm. Some enterprising black families purchased property as a way to avoid sharecropping and achieve a measure of independence from white-dominated society.
Okay, so journalist Zaid Jilani joins us now to discuss. Zaid, what do you make of this fact check? And let's say at the top, look, I'm no big fan of Tim Scott or his politics, opportunity zones, all of that, a lot of things to gripe with. But what was going on here in terms of this fact check?
Yeah, I mean, I think something important to remember here as background is that Tim Scott's been tapped to basically give the response to a marquee speech by Joe Biden. So I think a lot of conservatives looked at this immediately and thought of it as sort of a partisan response to that fact, right? They're kind of trying to take down or bring down the Republicans in terms of what they're doing against Joe Biden. But it was interesting in terms of the text of what, Glenn Kessler actually he wrote the fact check at the Washington Post. He's usually tapped to like fact check basic statements. Someone says something about Medicare. Okay, yeah, this is the truth of it. What was really interesting about this is that he didn't even rate it. He didn't rate any statement true or false. Basically, he took a statement by Tim Scott that he's made a number of times about his family, his extended family, his ancestors having to pick cotton to survive, drop out of school to do that, in fact. If you look at the passage in Tim Scott's book, he makes clear that, he left school and he worked on the farm. That was sort of implying that they owned the farm, because that was Glenn's kind of big point, was that, they actually owned the farm that they were working at. Therefore, maybe they weren't as poor as Scott has suggested. Of course, that doesn't really mean all that much in the grand scheme of things. There are a lot of poor family farmers out in the United States, particularly in the early 20th century, late 19th century. But the question is, and my colleague Sean Misrovian at our newsletter Inquire More at Substack, he kind of dug into this as, the issue with how they're addressing Scott is that they're seeing him purely through kind of the racial lens, right? Like Scott's family grew up in the Jim Crow South, but they had maybe a little bit more fortune than the average person in the Jim Crow South because they were able to own some land, right? They owned any number of acres. They were farming that land on their own. And they were able to, eventually build a small nest egg. The problem is that they weren't looking at them just as small family farmers, right? There are a lot of people, particularly in that region, the American South at the time, who were breaking their backs, working from, 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. at night, trying to create just a small bit of wealth that they can then carry on to their family. And in Tim Scott's case, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he was raised by a single mother, right, in deep poverty. It's certainly, it's not the case that he was, an heir to Monsanto or some big agribusiness or something, right? The fact that his family owned a little bit of land really doesn't distinguish him at all in terms of his life outcomes and what he had to struggle and work his way up through. And it's really interesting because Scott tells this story. He told this story at the RNC. He told this at the 2020 nominating convention. He tells it in his book. I think he tells this story because he talks about how he kind of believes in the American dream, right? He thinks that his family went from being in poverty to him being a U.S. senator within a generation. Of course, there are issues with that. Not everyone is so fortunate as that, but they did work their butts off, and it was a genuinely inspiring story. And I think a lot of folks on the left, they like to kind of compartmentalize those sorts of things because it kind of they feel like it distracts from their social agenda or their economic agenda to admit that there are people who actually do very well in this country and do go from poverty and to actually a good, stable middle-class life to being a U.S. senator. So I just think that, had the Washington Post written out this story, given them these details as part of a larger biography on Senator Tim Scott, as part of maybe debates about social mobility, I think it would have been fine. Doing it as a fact check, kind of, holding him accountable, kind of suggesting that he had misled people or lied, he really didn't, right? He kind of told the story as it was. He didn't give all the details. But if you have all the details, you just get sort of more of the nuance of the picture.
Yes.
It certainly isn't that he was lying, and it certainly isn't that he wasn't dirt poor. He was very, very poor, if you know anything about his childhood. The fact that they own a little bit of land just meant that they were in a circumstance of many other poor family farmers.
So in fairness to them, they decide not to issue any Pinocchios after a sort of long analysis of what he said versus what the records show, et cetera. And look, to be honest with you, I actually would like it if they investigated the origin stories that politicians tell more. Because as you're alluding to, those narratives are always used to support or bolster whatever their ideology is. So Tim Scott may have exaggerated a little bit about some of the family circumstances so that he can bolster his, look, in America, you just give everybody a chance. You don't really need the government's help. You create an opportunity zone and everybody can rise to the top, right? There are other stories that, you might pick like Kamala Harris, right? And we learned that some of her stories about being an activist since the time she was a baby and why I just want freedom, that turned out to have been lifted from elsewhere. Joe Biden used to talk about being a civil rights activist when actually all he really did was lifeguard at a majority black pool as his sort of civil rights activism during the time. So I actually like the idea of digging into the origin stories and finding out what's fact and what's fiction in a nuanced way. What I object to here is that it seems like that's only applied sometimes. So, for example, I don't want to say because I didn't extensively research Glenn Kessler's past work, but I don't know if he investigated Joe Biden's origin story. I don't know if he investigated Kamala Harris's origin story, dug into it with the same level of depth that you see here.
Yeah, and I mean, there's any number of politicians who described their backstories, and when you looked into it more, it was a lot more complicated than what they described at first. I do think, again, with the Scott thing, I think had they placed it in the context of maybe a profile of Scott or a biography of Scott, or maybe something just about, black farmers during that period, during Jim Crow, I think it would have been great. It would have been genuinely interesting. Some of what Kessler found was genuinely interesting. It added a lot of texture to Scott's backstory. But it was done in the context of a fact check, which are typically deployed when the politician is saying something that's false, or like they're exaggerating, or they're leading people on. He didn't really do any of that, right? Everything he said was accurate. There was no actual lie there. He didn't necessarily draw out the story the way that Kessler did and offer all the details, but essentially what he said was true, right? And I think that's ultimately why Kessler decided not to actually give it any rating. He just have kind of a long article where at the end of the day he says, okay, this is the full story, but we're not even going to grade him. I think that the fact that it was deployed as a fact check, which people will typically see that as a political opposition thing, right? They see that as oh, they got that person, right? That they caught him in the act, they caught him in the lie, they're a fibber. I think that's what really kind of angered people, and even some Democratic members of Congress. I believe there was maybe it was Karen Bass who tweeted something about how, they shouldn't have done this. He has a very interesting life story and he wasn't, should be respected. And so I think that was really what angered people about this. They were kind of implying without outright saying that Tim Scott embellished or lied. But he didn't really. He just, he didn't tell everything, but he didn't really embellish. Everything was accurate. So.
And like I said at the top, you want to go after Tim Scott? He sold that he was the front man for the Republican tax passage with the hashtag Keep Yo Money, and that is not a joke. I hope everybody goes. That's all you need in order to go after this man. Okay, Zaid, thank you for joining us.
Zaid, tell us about the newsletter.
Yes, plug the newsletter. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my friend Shant Misrobian, we have a newsletter at inquiry.substack.com. Basically, our goal is to have novel stuff that you're not going to see elsewhere. We're going to cover a lot of social science research. We're going to do some reporting. We're going to do some analysis. And basically the same sort of topics that we cover on Rising, the underreported stories, populism, so on and so forth. So
great. Well, very glad that you joined us, man. Appreciate
it. Everybody go subscribe. Zaid, thank you.
Bye.
Coming up, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He is being sued now over Florida's new, what he calls, anti-riot law. The New York Times' Jane Coaston is going to discuss the details when Rising continues.